Reactive training systems.
I imagine, Mike, you're talking about like some of the dose response meta-analyses that we've done recently. Yeah.
Yes.
So I'll give probably in a way that makes my skin crawl a little bit, like the really high level overview, and there's plenty of pockets of details that we can go into. So I will purposely be far from exhaustive here, but I'd say this kind of approach that our lab has taken uh, started with Zach because um, he basically, saw all this research on proximity to failure, and that's been something that we've been interested in for many years, and we've done previous work on. But ultimately, I would say there's two main observations that we made that Zach kind of recognized as like, okay, there's a better way to look at these questions. The first is that a continuous variable should be treated continuously and probably not in discrete buckets or even in like a binary. So it shouldn't be failure versus non-failure. Probably shouldn't even be like, failure versus 1 to 3 RER versus 4+ RER. There's limitations to the kind of bucketed approach. So that's the first observation, is that was the typical approach, whether it's proximity to failure or another common training variable like intensity or volume or frequency. The second observation is that training works, especially in the research, and any differences we see between effective training programs are going to be quite small, and there's going to be a lot of noise around those differences. Again, that's especially the case in the context of research studies and in the populations and the protocols that are used. So if we kind of pair those two ideas, that hey, we're trying to pick up on small differences, and secondly that we should treat a continuous variable continuously, basically, and I think I speak for Zach here, that it's like, okay, let's try to pick up on small differences by aggregating as much relevant data as we can and treat it continuously. So this started with Zach's meta-analysis and meta-regressions on proximity to failure, which you can just imagine on the x-axis is the number of reps in reserve, and then on the y-axis is how much gains occurred, whether that's muscle growth or strength gains. And an important thing to mention specifically for this conversation is that everything else is kind of like held equal, right? So if we're comparing 3 versus 1 rep in reserve on average between two conditions, the load used with someone training with 3 reps in reserve is similar to the load used as someone training with 1 rep in reserve. So it gets pretty detail oriented, and of course we can dive into that quite a bit, but to the absolute best you can from a study design perspective, everything is held equal except for the variable of interest. So all of that is to say is for the proximity to failure meta-regressions, what you see is that hypertrophy does benefit, at least in these short-term studies, which are about 10 weeks on average, from training closer to failure. Again, everything held equal the best we can. For strength, we actually saw like basically a completely flat line, which, I think would raise some eyebrows. I think it probably wasn't surprising to us, given we had read all of the individual studies up to that point. But I think when you start to think about the context of the studies, it makes sense. And that's not to say you should train with 10 reps in reserve all the time. And we can dive into that when that does and doesn't apply directly. But basically what you see is not a big effect of higher RPs in isolation for strength, but we do see a benefit for hypertrophy. And then we followed that up a couple years later with 2 separate manuscripts. The first was on volume and frequency on the weekly timeline. And then another recent preprint that we came out with, which was set volume on a per session basis, which all just for the sake of simplicity here, I'll just talk about the first one and we can later dive into the second one if we want to later on. But those variables I think are going to be pretty familiar to listeners. So the first is weekly set volume, where you basically count up, say, hey, if we're measuring quadriceps hypertrophy, how much, direct quad training was there, add all of that up. That's the number of sets per week on the x-axis. And then again, on the y-axis, you have hypertrophy or strength gain. In the case of strength gain, it's more relevant. The way we counted volume is more related to how specific it was to the lift itself. And what we saw for volume is that we see that more is better for hypertrophy. That does kind of taper off, but there was no clear point where it's like, all right, now we've definitely plateaued, or now, there's actually worse gains from additional volume. So kind of the sound bite we landed on for that is that more is better, but there's a smaller and smaller payoff as you go. And then for strength, the findings here were actually really interesting, such that there was a really, really strong effect of additional volume, but not for long. Basically, once you kind of get to that like 5 to 10 sets per week range, it started to plateau off. And if you just look visually at the graph, it basically looks like a plateau. Technically, it does increase just a little bit, but the effect is so small that, as a researcher, we can't say that's anything meaningful. And then the last one I'll quickly go over is frequency. We kind of saw the inverse, such that frequency seemed to have a notable effect up to kind of that moderate frequency range of, say, 2 to 3 times per week for strength gains. But for hypertrophy, it really didn't have an effect. You could maybe squint and say, 2 times per week is better than 1 time per week for hypertrophy, but there wasn't anything all that overwhelming. So hopefully that gives a pretty high level overview with sufficient detail to understand what's going on, but not to bore you guys to death. So
No,
curious where you guys want to take it from here.
I think it does for sure. And I would say as well, like anybody listening to this that uh, is interested in getting into more detail, like I listened to the podcast that you guys did on data driven strength that kind of went over a lot in detail. And there's a lot of kind of gems to be pulled from those details too. So I would definitely recommend checking that out and giving it a listen. Um, so kind of with that overall context, um, it's I mean there's a lot of things here that are interesting to me. Um, like the way that you guys counted volume here, I thought was an important distinction. And I don't has that I'm not aware of that being like a super common way of doing it as well. Like I forget off the top of my head where the term that you guys used, but kind of um, scoring things based on specificity and using that as like a factor in terms of counting the effective volume of the thing. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of coaches do in practice, um, but I'm not aware of it too much in research. Is that something that's commonly done?
Yeah, that's a good question, an important one, because it kind of contextualize. If you don't understand the independent variable of the research question, then it's hard to think about the practical conclusion. So I'm glad you brought it up. So yeah, the term that I guess you could say we introduced to the research is something that is just that. It's just introduced to the research. I think it's like you said, Mike, it's very common for coaches to explicitly or just intuitively count things like this in their head. So what we did in the paper is when we went through every single study one by one and we counted up the relevant volumes, we basically said, hey, was this, I'll start with hypertrophy and then I'll go to strength. Was this a direct set or an indirect set? So a basic example is if the biceps were being measured for hypertrophy. A bicep curl would count as one full set, so it's a direct set. But something like a lat pull down or a chin up, that would count as half of a set, or it would be classified as indirect. So if you did, 5 sets of curls in a week, 5 sets of pull ups in a week, that'd be 7.5 of these fractional sets. And that hasn't been done in the research before. I would say for good reason. It's like a little bit hand wavy because someone could have just listened to what I said and like a lat pull down and a chin up and a pull up. Those all might be different in terms of biceps growth. And I would say I agree. There's really no perfect way to measure this stuff. So what we had to do to kind of justify that as scientists is we not only like actually looked at this fractional method that I just outlined, but we also compared it to like the typical approach, which is just counting everything the same. And again, I understand why that's like was the most common up to this point in the research, is because that's just like a little bit more objective. It's like, hey, if the muscle was involved, just count it as a full set. So we did analyses to kind of prove, if you will, or at least provide evidence that that fractional approach is better. It can be a little bit frustrating as a research. You have to like, you know, justify every single step of the process. You know, that's part of the game, and there's good reason for that. So I would say that is a novel thing that we added to the research, even though in practice it's really not all that novel. But at the end of the day, I don't know if that's like the most practical thing in the world to say, hey, you have to count volume like this if you're a coach. Really, the main reason it matters is because that's going to increase the kind of granularity that we can actually look at these dose response relationships with. I'll be honest with you, when I'm when I'm quantifying volume for, you know, just my own training or a client's training, I kind of just count direct sets. I'm not too worried about those half a sets. I think direct sets are just a totally fine shorthand. But again, from a research perspective and looking at the question, you know, it gives us a little bit more insights. And then on the strength side of things, we counted like a full set if it was the exact lift trained. So if it was 1 rep max back squat, it was only a full set if you trained squats. But if you had, you know, lunges in there, we counted that as half a set. So that's kind of how it applied, whether it was hypertrophy or strength.
See, so I'm going to put you in the same bucket as Andrew and as guys who like to group these variables in like good enough buckets. And I don't know, where do you fall, Zach? Are you kind of one of these? Are you an optimizer? You get to be in my
Oh man, it
bucket.
depends what yeah, what context you're talking about. I think from a theoretical perspective, I'm always thinking about how to optimize like our mental frameworks. But when it comes to my own training, the way that I do things for myself, I don't think I could be farther in the opposite direction. I'm pretty I feel like I'm so anal about justifying the specifics of certain
Yeah.
things that if I can't exclusively justify a thing, I like convince myself that like, oh, this isn't worth the headache practically. But yeah, it's probably just a factor of my own personality.
Well,
But yeah, no, it's always something you have to wrestle with for
yeah.
sure. That I think is always something to think about for sure.
I'm joking, of course, and the irony of uh, putting people in buckets of like being the kind of optimizer that I am is not lost on me. But yeah, that's I do like that approach, and I mean that's something that I do as well. So there's a bit of a difference here too when you get to like the realm of practical application. Um, there's always kind of this: is the juice worth the squeeze question based on the systems that you have available. You know, uh, one like I talk sometimes about like I've got a dynamic load management system that I've been building and tweaking and stuff for a long time, years. And one of the ways that I got started on it was kind of like, you know, you hear about people who go off program and they max out or they overshoot their RPE or something like that happens. And coach kind of hand waves it a little bit and says, hey, get back on track, you know. And I thought, like, if you had infinite resources, is that the right answer? You know, like if you had all the resources to give the best answer, and it was the most important question, like, is that the best answer that you can come up with? And I didn't think that it was. So, and this is just kind of an interesting problem to me to try to figure out, like, okay, well, if you could build a system that accounted for these things and computers were doing all the math in the background for you, then does that lead to a better outcome? So that's kind of a bit about my headspace and probably some of the trade-off that is in play when you talk about stuff like this. Like, can you just kind of eyeball it? Like, well, we're just counting it as a half a set. Is it really half a set or not? Like, I don't know. It's up for debate. Like, why am I wasting all this time thinking about it? We just look at it. Yep, looks right. Move on. But then if you did make a decision, bam, done. Now you got a system for it, and it's calculating in the background. There's no more time invested into it. Maybe you would get a little bit better without any, additional effort after the system has been built. So anyway, that's my psychology, I guess.
I think you're spot on ultimately that like the trade-off to me that I always think about is like there is like this construct of the variable that we're essentially trying to approximate with what we have access to. And I think sometimes the paradox is if you try to approximate that with incomplete information, even though if it feels like you're being more precise with the way you're quantifying that, you actually might end up making worse predictions. And I think that's the paradox in a lot of this stuff is like someone could view the fact that treating all indirect sets as half in this case is an oversimplification, one that we would agree with. But the alternative is to make likely gross speculations on the exact scaling of the way that those things would operate. So if we treat everything the same, we might actually end up uncovering the reality that we're ultimately trying to approximate to a greater extent until we have more clarity of the actual speculations that would inform that construct of reality that we're trying to uncover. So I think that's always the trade-off with this kind of stuff. And Mike, I'm 1000% with you, and I'm sure Josh can probably attest to how annoying I am sometimes with trying to systematize assumptions and systematize decisions like this and in every nook and cranny that we possibly can, because I just think that's I've always loved your quote about at the end of the day what we're trying to do is put the right weight on the bar and lift it the right number of times. Like that is just such a ethos quote that I just love. And trying to just construct training systems around that more holistically. And I think I'm sure we'll get to it. But yeah, there's a lot of different practical things that I think kind of come from these series of projects that can kind of hopefully push us in the right direction for those types of things and think about things a little bit clearer from a practical perspective while balancing that aspect of that paradox almost.
Yeah. Kind of at risk of digging this rabbit hole too deep. This seems like a problem of reductionism where you reduce things too far almost or past the point of being useful. And look, I can attest as like trying to build out a system that has a lot of like accounts for all these details. There's so many decisions that get made just on the fly and so many things that like you're not even aware of until you try to externalize it. Like these gradients where, this much is okay, but that much is too much. And how you decide all this stuff is just like it's been really illuminating to try to build it into a system though, because once I've kind of realized some of this, like, hey, you're bringing in a lot of information, but still you're kind of going, okay, right about there. That looks about right to me. Well, why 4 sets and not 5 sets? The real answer is, I drew the line in this spot. We could make some reasons, like you can apply more reasoning to it, but ultimately it boils down to I drew the line in this spot and you drew the line in that spot, and it comes out to a different number of sets, which is a frustrating thing to hear for clients sometimes. Like at some level there needs to be some kind of answer and it not just be arbitrary in some way. But I mean, the fact is it just kind of is. And I wish it wasn't as much as anybody.
You're doing the same thing if you write a training program without any sort of system too. So, and that's the thing that's always the uncomfortable reality, I think, for people is that whether you want to, admit it or not, whether you're writing down a neural network or some close approximation thereof in a spreadsheet to come up with the answer to deliver the 4 sets, or you let the neural network in your brain develop that same exact 4-set answer, both of them are essentially going through the same process.
Yeah.
But some of them are just more comfortable with the reality of the assumptions that you're making rather than just letting those sit in the background and not really having to think about it. So I think, that's one of those things I think that just listing assumptions that you make for any sort of system or decision making, I think is a useful exercise for nothing more than just being aware of them and being aware of potential blind spots that are created anytime you do make an assumption.
There is a secret to great training programs, but it's not a magic set and rep scheme or this one weird exercise that powerlifting pros don't want you to know about. The secret is in your training log. You see, years ago, we began developing tools to help you unlock these secrets, and we've been putting them online for free ever since. That's right, it's free for everybody. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? People have been logging training forever, and you're right, but the secret isn't just in keeping a logbook. It's using that log to make better training decisions. That's the real secret. This is where the RTS training log excels. You haven't done SSB squats in 3 months and you're wondering what your target weight should be? We can help you with that. Did you overshoot on your top set and you're wondering if you should adjust your back off sets? We can help you with that too. Are you building the most important training block of this year and you're wondering what your most highly effective blocks have in common? Yep, we got you covered there too. There's more, there's a lot more. And yes, it is all free. Not just a free trial, not free with ads, just regular free. You go to reactivetrainingsystems.com, then you click on apps, sign up for a login, and you're in.